Our scripture reading this morning is from Galatians. I ask you, you who strive to be subject to the law, do you understand what the law asks of you? For scripture says that Abraham had 2 children, one by Hagar, who was a slave, and the other by Sarah, who was freeborn. The child of the slave had been begotten in the course of nature, but the child of the free woman was the fruit of the promise. All of this is clearly an allegory. The 2 women stand for the 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, and she gave birth to children in slavery. This is Hagar. Hagar represents Mount Sinai in Arabia, which corresponds to the present Jerusalem, which is in slavery like Hagar's children. But the Jerusalem on high is freeborn, and it's she who is our mother. That is why Scripture says, "Rejoice, you who are infertile, who has borne no children. Break into song, you stranger to the pains of childbirth. For there are more born of the forsaken one than born of the wedded wife." So ends our scripture reading. Ancient words from our tradition for today's present-day understanding.
Well, that's a strange passage, right? It's a little bit weird. Hopefully we can unpack it. If not, again, there's always refreshments after church. So even if I'm disappointing, the refreshments are delicious. So it's so easy to see the fundamentalism of others and so hard to see it in ourselves. When I talk about fundamentalism, I can't say often enough that I'm not really talking about another group of people or a different type of human being someplace else. We all can become fundamentalists when we're afraid, when we're frustrated. But what can happen in religion is it can trap us at that place. It can continually frighten us of other people, of people coming from another land, or people who live different or look different. And that's when religion becomes a huge problem. But it's not a different kind of human being. And only by beginning with our own fundamentalism can we understand how to help others out of theirs. Only by remembering the times when you were so frustrated that you just wanted to know what the rules were. Just put it in letters that I can read. I don't want to think. I don't want any ambiguity whatsoever. I want to know if you're my friend or you're my enemy. I want to know who's in, who's out. And if that doesn't sound familiar to you, talk to your spouse or significant others. Because again, this is incredibly easy to see in everybody else, but incredibly hard to spot when we do it. People look at Scripture and they think they're taking the plain meaning of the text. They don't realize that they're filtering it through their own experience and sometimes through their own trauma and pathology. Fundamentalists in the United States are able to see threats all around us. And they talk about innocent people like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and say, I found a verse in Scripture that I can use to beat them up with. How many times have you seen different versions of that? But have you ever in your life, ever seen a fundamentalist that talked about war in the same way they talk about diversity? Have you ever heard a fundamentalist say there are biblical weapons? The Bible's very clear that we need to fight with bows and arrows. Right? Modern weapons are unbiblical. You don't hear that one, do you? And there's nothing clearer in Scripture than that you can't charge interest. That you're not supposed to get rich by making other people poor. But see, the problem is, to actually recognize that verse of Scripture would mean you could not be a capitalist. You can't be a capitalist if you can't charge interest. You don't hear that one brought up very often, do you? Again, that's because we can see the flaws of other people a whole lot better than we can see our own. And we can look at the text and be sure this is exactly what God means. And the clearer we are, usually the more imbalanced we've become. There's a great line. This is Luther Burbank. He was born right before the Civil War. So this is a long time ago. But he's describing what he was observing at his own time that's become manifest in our own. He said, and to think of this great country, he's a botanist, he's a scientist. He goes, and to think of this great country in danger of being dominated by people ignorant enough to take a few ancient Babylonian legends as the canons of modern culture. Our scientists are paying for their failure to speak out earlier. There is no use now talking evolution to these people. Their ears are stuffed with Genesis. When we become afraid, when we become frustrated, we want something really simple. And it's very tempting to think we're doing that with Scripture. But we never are. We're very selective, we're very manipulative in terms of the text. This is what Bishop Spong had to say. He said, unless biblical literalism is challenged overtly in the Christian church itself, it will, in my opinion, kill the Christian faith. It is not just a benign nuisance that afflicts Christianity at its edges. It is a mentality that renders the Christian faith unbelievable to an increasing number of the citizens of our world. And that's hard to argue with. But if you have literalists in your life, you realize how hard it is to communicate. And again, the starting place is finding the fundamentalist within you. When you can find your inner Donald Trump, right? It's in there somewhere. When you can find those parts of yourself that you've disowned, because you may be even ashamed of it. But to realize it's not evil, it's fear, it's frustration, it's people who the world has changed and they don't know how to cope with it. If you can start there in your own life, then it's much easier to build bridges when you talk to other people. One last caveat before we start. It's not a caveat. It's this disclaimer that needs to be said every time we talk about these kinds of lessons, is that the problem that Paul is talking about is not Judaism. There are anti-Semitic texts in the New Testament, and we have to marginalize those and take them and put them in a context. The problem was and is a type of fundamentalism. And this doesn't mean that somebody who self-identifies as a fundamentalist is doing this. Right? We're talking about fear-based. We're talking about thinking they take the Bible literally. Thinking their subjective interpretation of the Scripture is what God thinks. Thinking their group is the one saved group. Those things are the fast track to violence. And most of us have our own version of this. If you don't believe liberals can do this, go on Facebook. All right, that tells me you're not on Facebook. If you don't think liberals can do this exact same thing. So, Paul quotes a passage from the historical texts of the Jewish scripture, the story of Sarah and Hagar. And then at the end of it, he says, and this is an allegory. Now think about that. He's quoting from something that's in Scripture in the most part we take most literally, that these things physically, historically happened. He tells the story, and he says it's symbolic. It's a symbol. It's a metaphor. And I'm glad I'm not translating in Spanish right now, because those are, I don't know how those words are easy to find. But do you get how radical something we've just heard that most people kind of gloss over? And what he's going to say is that those who take the Bible literally, that uphold the law and want to live under the law, and they're talking about the Scripture, he says, the letter of the law kills, the spirit of the law gives life. Again, how many times have you heard that in a Christian church? And this is Paul, the people that, people find a lot of clobber passages for. And I don't think Paul would be very happy with that, quite frankly. Notice that he says, there's these two women. Now, if you take it literally, it's still an incredibly cruel text. You have this poor woman who's getting kicked out. Remember, she had a child by Abraham, but then Sarah has a child by Abraham, so she gets kicked out because she's not part of the team, not part of the family. So that's hideous too. But it's a parable, or at least Paul is using it as a parable. And he says that one of the women stand for Mount Sinai. Now, what happened on Mount Sinai? The Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were given there. And he says that is the mountain of slavery. Because if you turn over responsibility to an ethical code, or you surrender your mind to a belief system, it's like you're in slavery. Now, what Paul is doing is not arguing about the text. He's going more deeply into the text and getting past the individual verses and finding the great themes of Scripture. One of the greatest themes of the Jewish Scripture is Exodus. Right? That's sort of the whole point, the whole sweeping point. But when you take a text literally, when you divide it up into numbers, the original text didn't have numbers, and you arrange them like Legos or something like that, you can build anything you want to build. But what Paul is saying is, what sense would it make for God to lead people out of slavery in Egypt if the point was for them to be slaves of religion? Here's what Augustine says. Now, Augustine is like one of the pillars of the ancient church, and people assume he was literalist. Listen to this. Often non-Christians know something about the earth, the heavens, and the other parts of the world. This is in the 400s. Other parts of the world about the motions and orbits of the stars, and even their sizes and distances. And this knowledge they hold with certainty from reason and experience. It is thus offensive and disgraceful for an unbeliever to hear Christians talk nonsense about such things, claiming that what they are saying is based in Scripture. We should do all we can do to avoid such an embarrassing situation, which people see as ignorance in the Christian and laugh to scorn. Augustine says, reckless and presumptuous expounders of Scripture, Bible thumpers in modern parlance, reckless and presumptuous expounders of Scripture, preachers like me, bring about much harm when they are caught in their mischievous false opinions by those not bound by our sacred texts. And even more so when they try to defend their rash and obviously untrue statements by quoting a shower of words from Scripture and even recite from memory passages which they think will support their case without understanding either what they are saying or what they assert with such assurance. Again, that was in the 400s. He's saying people who use the Bible to deny reality, right? Scientific reality, scientific discovery, evolution, the Big Bang, little thing called global warming, where diseases come from, human sexuality, the gestation process. He's saying when people use the Bible to silence truth, they are abusing Scripture and truth itself. So Paul is going to take the Scripture that literalists are quoting, and he's going to go more deeply into them to find the theme, the heart of it. Here's how, one more. This is somebody talking about text mania. One practical problem of this text mania is that the Bible, unlike the church, can't answer questions, clarify earlier statements, arbitrate disagreements, or deal with new developments. So it's like a map that somebody's given you, and there's a traffic jam, and you have to pretend like that's not there. Like you have to pretend like the buildings that have been torn down are still there. What we're needing is something that leads us into the present moment with our full capacity. What Paul realized is that human groups like to organize in hierarchies. They like to have authority figures. And he's saying this is slavery. When I, as a Christian, ordained Christian pastor, call Christ King or Lord, have I not elevated myself to viceroy in the process? Right? Because in the structure of the church ecclesiology, the structure of the church, there's a pecking order. And it can be disguised, it can be hidden. But what's more ridiculous than to say, you're saved by grace, but you have to come to an ordained clergy so we can put water on your head so your baby doesn't fry in hell for all eternity. But again, we're frightened, frustrated animals, and it shows. It shows. And then Paul says that just incredibly strange verse that he adds in there where he says, this is from Isaiah. Sing, infertile woman, you who never bore a child. Burst into song, shout for joy, you who were never in labor, because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband. Now, I think this is from Isaiah, and I think this is one of the inspirations for the notion of the virgin birth. Because there's a theme throughout Hebrew Scripture that people who others think are too old, too young, they can't have children, can wind up being at the very center of the story. Physically, in terms of the flesh, they may be disqualified. Remember, this was a culture that was very patriarchal. And if women couldn't have children or they displeased their husbands, they could be thrown out. And the options for them were very slim. Paul is saying, this is Paul, remember, this is Paul, the people that gets quoted as being sexist. The passages that tell women to obey their husbands were not written by Paul. Right? It's very important to realize that some of the late books that are attributed to Paul are not by Paul. That what Paul is saying here is that in this culture where childbirth is what gives women worth, he's saying no, it doesn't. And that a person who can't have children can have just as much impact in young lives as the biological source. I saw something online the other day that I just fell in love with, and it was a picture of a baby sitting there smiling, and it was covered with lipstick kisses all over, and then underneath it said grandmothers. And I thought, virgin birth. Right? Because the real parents, the biological parents, the adopted parents, however, you're so busy trying to keep them from getting killed that it almost takes somebody coming along later to find the wings of their soul. Sometimes it happens another way, but to realize that when you've been disqualified by your culture, your job didn't work out, you couldn't have the children you wanted to have, the divorce destroyed all of your plans for life. the diagnosis destroyed all of your plans for life. Whatever your version is, Paul is saying that's the flesh, it's not the spirit. It's unspiritual to say women should do this and men do that. Right? That's based on the flesh, according to Paul. To say that LGBTQ people should not have the same rights to safety, love, dignity, respect is the flesh, it is not the spirit. To say the poor brought it on themselves, to say immigrants and refugees should have to scale a wall to find asylum. These are all diseases. And a spiritual person would never do that. And again, Paul is referring to the theme of the Exodus, where people were in captivity, miserable captivity. They were considered worthless as human beings. They were liberated. And God tells them in the story, always remember this, and treat the stranger, the refugee, the people who wind up under your heel. Remember that you were slaves too. Remember that you were refugees once. And never forget that. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And what Paul is saying is, for freedom, Christ has set you free. That is a literal quote, which doesn't mean you have to take it literally. For freedom, Christ has set you free. The point of the theme of Exodus is not that you should be obedient, but that you should be liberated. Very different religion. And you can't really organize it, which is why you don't see it in most Orthodox churches. But it's what makes the message come alive. It's what makes it real. It's what would save the church from itself, is to return to the days before literalism and fundamentalism scarred the message. When you deal with a fundamentalist in your life, again, the starting place is your own heart. Because you can recognize the pain, the defensiveness that looks like cruelty. Right? You can go into that and go more deeply into people's trauma. You may not make a huge difference, but you can plant a seed. And Jesus said his word is like a seed. That's not a throwaway line. It's saying you don't take it literally. When you take text literally, that's like eating pine cones. You're supposed to take the text into your life and watch it grow. Because when we walk through the stories of Scripture, our perception widens and deepens. And we're able to see the stranger as a part of our own story. These are very calculated wisdom teachings. Jesus said the way you can tell it's true is that it sets you free. The truth will set you free. Well, dogma doesn't do that. Fundamentalism does not do that. When you say yes to this call to life, something happens and you begin to perceive a larger world. You see things you didn't see before. You feel things you didn't feel before. You recognize people as your family in a way you never did before. And it is that growth that is the proof that religion is working and that you're understanding the story in the right way. St. James Morrison lead singer of the Doors. Remember that the Doors were named after the doors of perception? And Morrison saw himself as somebody calling people to their deeper life. Now, he may have overdone a few things. But listen to this. This is talking about his poetry. He says, if my poetry aims to achieve anything, it's to deliver people from the limited ways in which they see and feel. Now, wouldn't Scripture feel differently if you understood that's what it is calling you to do? Not to be something you're not, but to be more fully who you are. We can't do it if we take it literally, but our heart is able to steer through. That's why children can take these things and go straight to what we need to understand. They're already doing it. This is what Crossan said, and we're almost done. Crossan says, my point once again is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we are now dumb enough to take them literally. When Paul tells you a story, it's not about history. It's about your own journey as a human being through the cosmos. And what he's saying today, as clearly as he possibly can, for freedom, Christ has set you free. Do not return to a religion of slavery. I invite you now to your own reflection on these words.